He was never meant to walk free, and every single time they let him breathe the open air, someone died. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. This story was created through many hours of quiet investigation and careful focus. Each element has been thoughtfully included to offer a calm listening experience while presenting these events with sincerity and respect. The purpose of this channel is to remember and share the stories that might otherwise be lost to time. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the man who never stopped killing, even behind bars. Roberto Jose Carmona, aka La Hiena Humana, the human hyena. Now let's begin. Argentina produced monsters. History recorded them. Courts sentenced them. Prisons held them. But Roberto Jose Carmona, a name that, once spoken in Cordoba, lowered voices and quickened steps, was something the justice system had never truly prepared for. He did not fit the profile of a man who simply snapped. He was not a product of a single catastrophic moment. He was a slow-building catastrophe, a man assembled piece by a world that discarded him before he ever had the chance to become anything else. And what he became was terrifying. He carried death in his hands wherever he went, on the open highway, in the darkness of a prison cell, on a Tuesday afternoon when the rest of Argentina was watching football. For confirmed victims, for families shattered, decades of violence stretching from 1986 all the way to 2022. 3 life sentences, and not once, not a single time, did the courts, the prisons, or the system manage to stop him before another body dropped. This is the story of the human hyena, and it begins, as all the worst stories do, with a child that nobody wanted. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Buenos Aires Province, Argentina, 1963. A boy is born without a father on record to a woman named Magdalena Benet who, by her own circumstance, could not afford to keep him. His name was Roberto Jose Carmona, and from the very first breath he drew, the world made it clear that there was no place for him in it. Magdalena left him at the Villa Elisa home in La Plata. He was an infant, too young to understand abandonment, too young to name the feeling that would root itself inside him and grow like a weed through concrete. The Villa Elisa home was not a place of warmth. Carmona would later speak about those years with a chilling flatness, describing how other children beat him, how the authorities responsible for his care left him hungry, how he was hit and left without food as if he were something less than human. Whether every detail of what he claimed was verified or embellished matters less than the documented truth that Roberto Carmona grew up inside an institution that failed him at every turn. He was then transferred to a convent, where the abuse he maintained did not stop. It changed hands, perhaps, different faces, different reasons, but the violence continued. A child learning day after day that the world's primary language was pain, that power meant hurting before being hurt, that survival required a willingness the soft-hearted could never develop. When he was 7 years old, his mother took him back. This might have been the moment that saved him. It was not. Magdalena was absent for the greater part of each day, working, surviving herself, leaving the boy alone in a home that felt more like a waiting room than a family. Carmona grew resentful of her. Not just indifferent, resentful, the kind of slow-burning bitterness that poisons everything it touches. By the time he was 10 years old, Roberto Carmona had committed his first robbery. He broke into a police car and walked away with a .45 caliber pistol. 10 years old. The audacity of that act says everything about who he already was. Someone who did not fear authority, who understood that strength came from the weapon in your hand, and who had already stopped waiting for the world to give him anything. His teenage years were spent cycling through juvenile detention facilities across Argentina. The system processed him the way it processed all the broken ones, with paperwork and transfers and evaluations that never quite resulted in intervention. He became fluent in the language of institutions. He knew how to exist inside them, how to present himself, how to wait. Waiting was something Carmona was very good at. As a young adult, the crimes escalated. Robbery became his primary occupation. He passed through the prisons of Olmos, Sierra Chica, San Nicolas, La Plata, and Junín, a tour of Argentina's most notorious correctional facilities, each one failing to correct anything. In 1982, when he was approximately 19 years old, he was sentenced to 10 years for aggravated robbery, deprivation of liberty, and drug usage. Marijuana and pills had been part of his life since adolescence, another layer of numbing over whatever it was he carried underneath. He should have served that sentence fully. He did not. On January 10, 1986, Roberto José Carmona was released on parole. He had served approximately 4 years of a 10-year sentence. Whatever assessment had been made of him, whatever boxes had been ticked on whatever form authorized his release, they were catastrophically wrong. He was 22 years old. He was free, and he was already something that could not be undone. 4 days after his release, on the night of January 14, 1986, Carmona was driving his Ford Taunus along Route 20, near Villa Carlos Paz in Córdoba province. It was late. The roads were quiet. And then his headlights caught 3 young people standing on the side of the road. A flat tire, a dead car, and the vulnerability of youth. Their names were Gabriela Seppi, 16 years old, and her 2 friends, Guillermo Elena and Alejandro del Campillo. They had been at a dance club and were trying to get home. Carmona pulled over. He helped them change the tire. He was calm, perhaps even charming, helpful enough that none of them felt the need to run. When the tire was fixed and they gathered their things, Carmona drew a gun. He took their belongings. He forced Gabriela Seppi into his car, and he drove away into the dark. Her friends stood on the side of the road in horror, helpless, watching the tail lights disappear. They had no way to know what was happening to her. They had no way to know that Gabriela Seppi was already in the hands of someone who had spent his entire life being stripped of everything, and had decided, in some cold and irreversible part of himself, that he would never be stripped of power again. Carmona drove for several kilometers before stopping alongside a dirt road. There, in the darkness, he raped her. Then he continued driving, taking her further, deeper, farther from anything familiar, to a place called Toledo. There, he sexually abused her a second time, and when it was done, he forced her out of the car, stood her on the ground, and shot her in the head. Gabriela Seppi was 16 years old. He left her body there and drove toward Villa Maria. Along the way, he picked up 2 hitchhikers, Norberto Ortiz and Sergio Peroni, and introduced himself as an army corporal. He had the gun. He had the car. And now he had an audience he could command. He forced the 2 hitchhikers to help him rob 2 fishermen they encountered along the road, turning innocent strangers into terrified accomplices within minutes. The police eventually received word of Gabriela's abduction. The investigation began. Carmona continued his rampage across the province, robbing, threatening, moving. On February 11, 1986, less than a month after Gabriela was murdered, he was arrested in General Pacheco. At the time of his arrest, he had just kidnapped a taxi driver and an entire family in order to rob them. He was placed on trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Roberto José Carmona was convicted of murder, multiple counts of aggravated robbery, and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison. Argentina breathed. The monster was caged, except he was not a monster that cages could contain. He was something more patient, more persistent, and infinitely more dangerous than the bars around him. Because for Roberto José Carmona, prison was not the end. It was simply the next stage. He was transferred to San Martin prison in Córdoba to serve his life sentence. The case had generated enormous public attention in Argentina. Gabriela Seppi's name was known across the country. Her father's grief was visible and raw and public. And the man who had taken her, who had picked up a 16-year-old girl on the side of a road and murdered her 4 days after walking out of prison, was now inside the system that had already failed to hold him once. But something else happened alongside the public horror. Letters began arriving for Roberto Carmona. Love letters. Women, drawn to something in his notoriety, his story, his danger, began writing to him. They visited him. One of them, eventually, he married in a prison ceremony. The same man who had raped and killed a teenager and terrorized strangers on dark roads was receiving declarations of love inside his cell. It was disturbing. It was also entirely beside the point, because what happened next in that prison had nothing to do with love. In 1988, 2 years into his sentence, Carmona got into a confrontation with a fellow inmate named Martín Castro. The reason, according to Carmona himself, delivered with a bluntness that made the skin crawl, was that Castro had refused to lend him his wife for sexual purposes. The logic of a man who did not recognize other human beings as having the right to refuse him. He stabbed Castro. Castro survived the initial attack. But Carmona was not finished. Hours later, while Castro lay sleeping, Carmona poured boiling water over his face. The burns were severe. Martín Castro survived, but his face was permanently disfigured. A walking reminder of what Roberto Carmona was capable of even in a place designed to contain him. The prison system noted this, transferred him, managed him, but did not fundamentally stop what he was. In 1994, a group of prisoners attempted to lynch Carmona following a fight. Their leader was a man named Héctor Vicente Belilla. Whatever transpired in that confrontation, the outcome was not Carmona's death. It was Belilla's. Carmona stabbed him to death. The exact murder weapon was never recovered, which said something about how carefully he operated even in the chaos of a prison riot. He was convicted and sentenced to an additional 16 years, layered on top of the life sentence he was already serving, as if the math of punishment meant anything to a man already behind bars forever. He was transferred to the Chaco Regional Prison. Then, because of his continued violence, to a maximum security facility in Resistencia. But the walls and the distance from his original cell changed nothing about what lived inside him. 3 years after killing Belilla in 1997, Carmona killed again. His third victim was a fellow inmate named Demetrio Perez Araujo. The weapon Carmona used was a broomstick, specifically the sharpened end of one, which he had modified into a makeshift blade. He drove it into Perez Araujo's chest, puncturing him with something that should never have been a weapon. For this murder and the cumulative weight of his prior crimes, he received his second life sentence without the possibility of parole. 2 life sentences, 3 confirmed kills before the year 2000. A scarred inmate whose face he had melted with boiling water. A man who had been in continuous state custody since 1986 and had managed, across the span of that custody, to keep killing. And the Argentine justice system, stretched, overburdened, never quite knowing what to do with a man this consistent in his violence, kept him locked away and hoped that would be enough. In 2011, after multiple psychiatric evaluations conducted over years, Roberto Jose Carmona was formally diagnosed as a psychopath. The professionals who assessed him documented something that those who had crossed his path had already understood instinctively. He was incapable of empathy. Genuinely incapable. He did not experience the suffering of others as something real. He sought to kill, the reports noted, for simple pleasure. Not rage, not fear, not desperation. Pleasure. The diagnosis explained nothing that needed explaining. It named what was already visible, but it served as a formal, documented confirmation that the man Argentina had been holding for 25 years was not going to change. Could not change. Was not wired for it. He was in his late 40s by then. Had spent more of his life inside prisons than outside them. Had killed 3 people and disfigured a 4th. Had 2 life sentences stacked like weights that could never be heavy enough to crush what he carried. And somehow, the decisions that followed would allow him to leave. To spend time studying the prison years of Roberto Jose Carmona is to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about Argentina's correctional system. Not merely its failures, but its structural blindness to the specific type of danger it was housing. Carmona was not unpredictable. He was, in fact, ruthlessly consistent. Every time he was placed in a position of vulnerability, he responded with violence. Every time he was threatened, he escalated. Every time the system loosened its grip, something terrible followed. And yet, decade after decade, the same system kept finding ways to loosen that grip. Let us go back into those years. Let us walk the corridors he walked. After his conviction for the murder of Gabriela Seppi in 1986, Carmona arrived at San Martin prison in Córdoba as a man already infamous. His case had been covered extensively across Argentine media. Gabriela's father, devastated and publicly vocal about his grief, had made sure that his daughter's name was not forgotten. The newspapers had detailed the abduction, the rape, the execution-style shooting. Roberto Carmona was not an anonymous prisoner. He arrived as a figure already defined by what he had done. Inside the prison, he adapted. He always adapted. The institutions of his childhood had taught him how to navigate confinement, how to read the social architecture of controlled spaces, how to identify the weak and the powerful and position himself accordingly. He was not passive. He was calculating. The attack on Martín Castro in 1988 was not an impulsive act, or at least the follow-up was not. Stabbing Castro in the initial confrontation might be explained away as the explosive violence of a man without restraint. But waiting until Castro was asleep, then retrieving boiling water, thinking that far ahead, preparing that specific kind of pain, and then carrying it to where the man lay and pouring it across his sleeping face. That was deliberate. That was savored. That was someone who had thought about the act before committing it, who understood exactly what it would do to human skin, and who did it anyway. Castro's face was permanently destroyed. He carried the evidence of Carmona's rage on his body for the rest of his life. He survived, but the man who had been before the attack did not. The prison system's response was to transfer Carmona. This became the pattern. Whenever he erupted, he was moved. A different facility, a different set of walls, different guards who might not yet know the full weight of what they were managing. The transfers gave the illusion of control while achieving almost nothing. By the time he killed Héctor Vicente Belilla in 1994, Carmona had been incarcerated for 8 years. 8 years of navigating prison politics, 8 years of building whatever standing he had among the other prisoners, 8 years of learning which lines could be crossed and which required careful timing. When Belilla's group moved against him, attempting to lynch him after a fight, Carmona did not flee or call for guards or wait for intervention. He killed the group's leader, precisely, efficiently, with a weapon that was never found. That last detail is worth pausing on. The murder weapon was never recovered. In a maximum security prison, surrounded by guards, cameras, locked doors, and limited space, Carmona managed to dispose of the murder weapon so completely that it was never located. He was convicted on other evidence, but the fact that the weapon was never found speaks to a methodical, calm mind operating even under the pressure of post-violence chaos. He was not panicking. He was managing the aftermath. The additional 16-year sentence was attached to his existing life term. The legal architecture of his punishment grew more complex. More sentences, more years, more documentation, while the man it was designed to contain kept breathing, kept planning, kept existing inside Argentina's prison system with a body count that now stood at 2 confirmed murders, 1 attempted murder with severe disfigurement, and an unknown number of assaults and threats that never made it to trial. The transfer to Chaco Regional Prison marked a new chapter. Chaco Province is in northeastern Argentina, far from Córdoba, far from the courts and the journalists and the family members of his victims. The distance was logistical necessity, a management decision by a system that needed to spread its most dangerous prisoners across the geography of the country. But for Carmona, it was simply a new setting for the same performance. He did not settle. He did not quiet. In 1997, 3 years after the Belilla killing, he attacked Demetrio Pérez Araujo. The weapon, the sharpened end of a broomstick, said something about improvisation and patience in equal measure. Someone had taken an ordinary object, a cleaning tool, something unremarkable and institutional and overlooked, and over time had worked its end into something sharp enough to puncture a chest cavity. That takes time. That takes the kind of focused, patient preparation that most people associate with projects and goals, not murder. Carmona had turned the waiting time of a prison sentence into the preparation period for another killing. He drove the sharpened broomstick into Perez Araujo's chest. The wound was fatal. His second life sentence without parole arrived in the courtroom like a formality. The judges, the lawyers, the witnesses, all of them understood that the numbers being attached to this man's name in legal documents bore no relationship to any realistic future in which Roberto Carmona walked free. 2 life sentences stacked, an additional 16 years from Bolivia, the arithmetic of permanent incarceration. But Argentina's legal system is not always as permanent as its language. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Carmona remained at the maximum security facility in Resistencia. He was, by any assessment, one of the most dangerous inmates in the country. And yet he was also, in certain administrative ways, treated as a man capable of being managed through the ordinary channels of prison governance, review boards, psychological assessments, classification upgrades, incremental privileges. The love letters continued. Women wrote to him from across Argentina, drawn by something dark that fame and notoriety can produce in the human psyche. He was covered periodically in the press. La Voz del Interior in Córdoba ran pieces on him. The national papers revisited his case during anniversaries of Gabriela Seppi's death, and each article renewed the public's awareness that he was still alive, still inside, still present somewhere in the prison network. He eventually married one of the women who had written to him, a ceremony conducted within the confines of the institution, with whatever legal permissions such arrangements required. His wife lived in Córdoba. She suffered from osteoarthritis that severely limited her mobility. She also had a quadriplegic son who required ongoing medical care. These facts, legitimate, documented human facts about a woman who had chosen to bind her life to one of Argentina's most dangerous men, became, over time, the basis for a decision that still defies easy explanation. In 2014, authorities approved a program of temporary leave for Roberto José Carmona. The terms were specific: 3 days out of prison every 4 months to visit his partner in Córdoba. The stated humanitarian reason was her inability to travel to see him due to her physical condition and her caregiving responsibilities for her son. A man with 2 life sentences, convicted of 3 murders, formally diagnosed as a psychopath incapable of empathy, was being granted supervised visits to a private residence 3 days at a time, 4 times a year. The supervision, such as it was provided by prison guards assigned to accompany him. Their job was to ensure he did not escape, did not harm anyone, did not use the temporary freedom as a window into something worse. 6 guards were assigned to manage him during these visits. For years, it appeared to work. Years passed without incident during these supervised absences. The system, perhaps, breathed a little. Perhaps the assessments that authorized the arrangement seemed validated by the absence of catastrophe. Perhaps no one fully accounted for the possibility that Carmona was simply waiting for the right moment, learning the patterns, studying the guards, watching the rhythms of distraction and attention. In October 2021, something happened that should have recalibrated every assumption being made about him. Inside the penitentiary complex 2 in Sáenz Peña, following a refusal by prison authorities to provide him with a mobile phone so he could communicate with his relatives, Roberto José Carmona took a needle and thread and sewed his own mouth shut. He sat in his cell with the thread through his lips and refused to eat until his demand was addressed. The psychological profile of a man who would sew his mouth closed to make a point, who would choose that particular form of self-mutilation as a bargaining tool, is not the profile of a man nearing rehabilitation. It is the profile of someone completely committed to having his will prevail, regardless of the cost to his own body. Someone for whom the body, his own and others, is a tool to be used in pursuit of what he wants. The authorities, managing the situation as a crisis, eventually addressed his concerns, and the program of temporary visits continued. He was now in his late 50s. He had been in continuous custody since 1986. He had killed 3 people while inside the prison system. He had disfigured another. He had been diagnosed as a psychopath. and he was still being granted supervised exits to visit his wife in Cordoba. The next exit would be his last. December 13th, 2022. Cordoba, Argentina. The afternoon was electric with a specific kind of national energy that only arrives once every 4 years. Argentina was playing Croatia in the FIFA World Cup semifinal. The entire country had stopped. Every television, every phone screen, every bar and living room and street corner was tuned to the same broadcast. 90 minutes of football that, to Argentina, felt like a matter of national soul. Roberto Jose Carmona was at his wife's house in the Las Violetas neighborhood of Cordoba, serving one of his authorized 3-day visits. 6 prison guards were present, tasked with monitoring him. They were human beings. They were Argentine. The semifinal had just kicked off. At 4:15 p.m., in the middle of the first half, Carmona told the 6 guards that he needed to use the bathroom. He walked out. In the moments that followed, while Argentine fans held their breath across the nation watching their team on the pitch, Roberto Jose Carmona stepped out of a residential house in Cordoba and moved toward the street. The guards, distracted by a football match that the entire country had agreed was the only thing that mattered that afternoon, did not immediately notice that the most dangerous man in their custody was no longer inside. Within minutes of walking out that door, Carmona flagged down a taxi. The driver's name was Javier Rodrigo Bacalin. He was 45 years old. He had a family. He had a life. He had made the ordinary, completely unremarkable decision to work that afternoon, steering his cab through Cordoba streets while a football match played on the radio. He stopped for a fare. He did not know what had just gotten into his car. What came next was documented in clinical detail during the subsequent trial, and it was horrific. Carmona stabbed Javier Bacalin 5 times in the neck, 4 times in the chest, and twice in the left leg. 11 stab wounds. Delivered in rapid succession, in the confined space of a taxi cab, to a man who was simply driving. Bacalin died on the spot. He had no time to escape, no time to resist in any meaningful way, no time for anything except the sudden, violent end of everything. Carmona placed the body in the passenger's seat. Then he took the wheel and drove. He drove for 15 minutes through the streets of Cordoba with a dead man in the seat beside him, navigating a city that was watching football, whose guards were watching football, whose attention was pointed at a screen and not at the roads. At the corner of Santa Ana and Felix Paz Street, he lost control of the vehicle and crashed. He walked away from the wreckage. He left Javier Bacalin's body in the crashed car and kept moving. His next stop was a supermarket. He walked in, found a couple, assaulted them without hesitation, and stole their vehicle. Just like that, a new car, a new route, the same cold efficiency that had defined every one of his crimes going back to 1982. He drove for approximately 11 kilometers before abandoning that car for reasons investigators never fully determined. On foot again, he made his way to the Valles Sarsfield clinic. There, in the parking area, he located a woman and her mother who were preparing to leave. He approached them. When the woman resisted his attempt to steal their vehicle, Carmona drew his knife and slashed her hands. She was injured but survived. He moved on. All of this, the escape, the murder, the car crash, the assault at the supermarket, the theft of the second vehicle, the attack at the clinic, unfolded over the course of approximately 2 hours. 2 hours during which Roberto Jose Carmona moved through the city of Cordoba with the confidence of a man who had been planning this, or something like it, for a long time. At 6:15 p.m., following a large-scale police manhunt that had been launched once the guards realized their prisoner was gone, Roberto Jose Carmona was apprehended. He had been free for approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, he had committed murder, crashed a stolen vehicle, committed armed robbery, stolen a second vehicle, and attacked a woman. When the police asked him why he had escaped, his response became one of the most widely quoted lines of his case. He said, "I don't know. They painted me as the violent one." He said this having just stabbed a taxi driver 11 times. The reaction in Argentina was immediate and overwhelming. The story broke across every major news outlet within hours. The facts were simultaneously enraging and baffling. How had this man been granted supervised visits? How had 6 guards allowed him to walk out of a house during a World Cup semifinal? How had a man with 2 life sentences, 3 murder convictions, and a formal diagnosis of psychopathy been placed in a private residence with only 6 escorts and no physical restraints? Javier Bacalin's family was devastated. His death was the kind of preventable tragedy that turns grief into fury. He had been a working man, a taxi driver navigating an ordinary afternoon, killed by someone who should never have been anywhere near a public street. The 6 guards who had been assigned to watch Carmona were arrested following his recapture. An investigation was launched into whether their negligence constituted criminal complicity in Bacalin's murder. The broader question: who had authorized the supervised visit program, who had signed off on allowing a 3-time murderer and diagnosed psychopath to be placed in a private home with limited oversight, began working its way through the Argentine legal and political system. Carmona was transferred to Cruz del Eje prison, a maximum security facility where, for the first time in years, the conditions of his confinement were tightened significantly. He would face trial for the murder of Javier Bacalin, his 4th trial for homicide. The case was assigned to the 8th Chamber of the Crime Court in Córdoba. The forensic evidence was comprehensive. The 11 stab wounds told a story of ferocity, of commitment to the act, of someone who was not simply killing to escape but was killing with a totality that left no room for survival. 5 wounds to the neck alone, each one potentially fatal on its own. The positioning of the body in the passenger's seat afterward suggested someone operating with a surreal calmness following the act, using the dead as simply another object to manage. Prosecutor Hugo Antolin Almiron and prosecuting attorney Carlos Ney, who represented the Bacalin family, built a case that went beyond the murder itself, framing it within the full context of Carmona's history, his prior convictions, his diagnosis, and the systemic failures that had put him in position to kill again. They argued that the murder of Javier Bacalin was not merely a crime committed in the chaos of an escape attempt. It was a crime committed by a man whose capacity for exactly this kind of violence had been documented and confirmed across 4 decades, and against whom the state had failed to maintain adequate protection. Sergeant Marcos Emmanuel Moreno, the police officer who had led the investigation into Carmona's route during the escape, testified about the timeline, the precision of the reconstruction, mapping each stop, each vehicle, each crime, each minute of those 2 terrible hours, laid bare not just what had happened but how efficiently it had happened. Carmona had not stumbled through those 2 hours in a panic. He had moved with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent decades thinking about what he would do if he ever had the chance. The trial was scheduled and conducted with the full weight of public attention. Argentina had not forgotten Carmona. Gabriela Seppi's father, who had spent decades as a public voice of grief for his daughter, followed the proceedings. The Bacalin family sat in the courtroom and waited for a justice that, however late, however insufficient, was the only thing the legal system could now offer them. What happened in the courtroom over those trial days was not a surprise to anyone who had followed the evidence. But it was a confrontation with the accumulated horror of a single man's capacity for destruction. Spanning 1986 to 2022, from the roadside where Gabriela was taken to the Córdoba streets where Javier Bacalin bled out in the front seat of his own taxi, Carmona sat in court within a glass-enclosed security arrangement, a sealed box designed to prevent any interaction with witnesses, family members, or the public. He was now in his early 60s, a man who had been behind bars for the majority of his adult life. The glass structure around him was a statement as much as a security measure, a visible acknowledgement that the ordinary courtroom protocols were not sufficient for him. He was observed to be calm. He was always calm. On May 17, 2024, Roberto José Carmona was convicted by a popular jury at the 8th Chamber of the Crime Court in Córdoba for the murder of Javier Rodrigo Bacalin. The verdict was unanimous. He received his 3rd life sentence. This one added to the 2 he already carried, a sentence with no possibility of parole, stacked on top of permanent incarceration that had begun 38 years earlier. The number of his formal legal penalties, assembled across 4 criminal trials, was staggering in its weight. 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole for Gabriela Seppi, Demetrio Perez Araujo, and Javier Bacalin. An additional 16 years for Héctor Vicente Bolilla. a 20-year sentence from the 1982 robbery and related crimes. The mathematics of justice applied to a man who, by any measure, had exhausted the system's capacity to punish him through arithmetic. He was 61 years old. He had been incarcerated since February 11, 1986, with the single exception of the temporary supervised visits granted from 2014 onward. He is, as of the current date, one of the longest-serving prisoners in Argentina's history, behind only Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch, known as the Angel of Death, who was convicted in the 1970s and remains incarcerated to this day. The comparison to Robledo Puch was not accidental in the Argentine consciousness. Puch had fascinated and horrified the country for decades. Young, photogenic, responsible for a killing spree that left 11 people dead in the early 1970s. Carmona occupied a different register of horror. Not the explosive, short-duration violence of a spree, but the long, unrelenting, inescapable violence of a man who could not be stopped even when locked in a box. Who killed in the open and killed in a cell and killed in a car crash's aftermath on a football afternoon. Who had, by the time of his final conviction, spread death across 4 separate decades of Argentine history. The aftermath of the 2022 escape and the Bacalin murder forced Argentina into an uncomfortable national conversation about prison management, supervised leave programs, and the way the judicial system calibrated risk for its most dangerous inmates. The questions were pointed and largely without satisfying answers. How had the temporary leave program been authorized for a man with Carmona's profile? The humanitarian argument. His wife's illness, her son's disability, was real. But the risk calculation behind granting that authorization required weighing genuine compassion against documented evidence of what this particular man did when given access to the open world. The 2 previous occasions on which he had been free, the 4 days between his 1986 parole and his first murder, and then the 2 hours of his 2022 escape, had each produced a killing. The 6 guards who allowed him to walk to the bathroom unsupervised during a World Cup semifinal faced criminal investigation. Whether individual negligence or systemic failure, or both, were responsible remained contested. But their presence at his wife's house, assigned by the state to prevent exactly what happened, formed the final link in a chain of decisions that ended with Javier Bacalin's body in the passenger's seat of his own taxi. Bacalin's family pursued justice through Carlos Ney, their attorney, who had been present through the entire trial process. The family's grief was particular and profound. Not only had they lost Javier to an act of murderous violence, but that violence had been made possible by a state system that had repeatedly demonstrated its inability to safely contain the man responsible. The tragedy was not random in the way that most sudden deaths are random. It was structured, it was preventable, and it had been prevented right up until the moment it wasn't. The Seppi family had lived with the knowledge of Carmona's continued existence for 38 years. Gabriella's father had spoken publicly over the years, in newspaper interviews, in documentary segments, in the sustained, painful presence that some victims' families maintain in the public record simply because silence feels like another kind of erasure. When the 2022 escape happened, when Bacalin was killed, Gabriella's father's grief gained a new dimension. The proof that the man who had murdered his 16-year-old daughter had gone on to kill again, and again, and again, across the span of a lifetime in which Gabriella had not been permitted to age a single day. Carmona, for his part, had never expressed remorse in any form that investigators, psychologists, or courts found credible. The psychiatric assessment of 2011 had been clear. He did not experience the suffering of others as something real. His comment after the 2022 escape, the assertion that others had merely painted him as the violent one, was not the statement of a man misrepresented by a hostile system. It was the statement of a man who genuinely did not recognize any equivalence between his experience of the world and the experiences of the people he had destroyed. That is, in some ways, the most terrifying element of the entire case. Not the individual acts of violence, though those are horrific enough. Not the accumulation of victims across decades. Not even the systemic failures that allowed him to keep killing. The most terrifying element is the coherence of it, the way that Roberto José Carmona maintained, from the age of 10 when he stole a pistol from a police car to the age of 59 when he stabbed a taxi driver 11 times, a completely consistent internal logic. A world in which he was the only person whose comfort, whose desires, whose survival, and whose will mattered. A world in which everyone else was either an obstacle or a resource. Psychiatry gave this a name: psychopathy. But naming it doesn't shrink the horror of watching it operate across an entire human lifetime. His case raised, and continues to raise, questions about what correctional systems are actually designed to do with people who cannot be corrected. Argentina's prison system, like those of most nations, operates on a theoretical foundation that includes rehabilitation, the idea that incarceration is not merely punishment but an opportunity for change. That assumption is complicated almost to the point of irrelevance when applied to someone like Carmona, whose formal psychological evaluation confirmed that change of the relevant kind was not possible. He had been in custody almost continuously for nearly 4 decades. He had received sentences totaling multiple lifetimes. He had been evaluated, transferred, managed, reclassified, diagnosed, and monitored by an enormous array of institutional machinery, and across every one of those decades the body count had grown. Castro, disfigured in 1988. Bolilla, stabbed to death in 1994. Perez Araujo, killed with a sharpened broomstick in 1997. Bacalin, stabbed 11 times in 2022. The prison within which he now sits, Cruz del Eje, houses him under what are, by current account, the most restrictive conditions of his entire incarceration. The glass enclosure in court during the 2024 trial was an architectural statement. This man cannot be trusted within ordinary human proximity. The management protocol around him has been, at last, calibrated to the reality of who he is rather than the theoretical possibility of who he might have become. He is now in his early 60s. The man who was abandoned at the Villa Elisa home as an infant, who stole a pistol at 10, who stepped out of prison in January 1986 and within 4 days had raped and murdered a 16-year-old girl, who then spent the next 36 years killing people in cells and on Cordoba streets. That man is now old, aging, still behind the glass. Argentina does not have the death penalty. It has not had it since the 1980s, when the transition to democracy brought with it a rejection of capital punishment as part of the broader rejection of the state violence that had defined the military dictatorship. In that moral framework, Roberto José Carmona will die in prison. He will die old, possibly very old, given the longevity common among those whose every need is institutionally managed. And the question of what justice looks like in that outcome. 3 life sentences served simultaneously, which is to say, 1 life ending in a cell, is one that legal philosophers, crime journalists, and the families of his victims have all been forced to sit with. There is no answer that satisfies. The families of Gabriela Seppi, Hector Bolilla, Demetrio Perez Araujo, and Javier Bacalin each carry a different version of the same grief: the permanent, unresolvable absence of someone taken. None of them got their person back. None of them will. The sentences imposed on Carmona do not restore anything. They are, at best, a promise that no 5th victim will exist. That promise, given the history, is one Argentina can be forgiven for watching with something closer to vigilance than trust. Roberto José Carmona has spent more than half a century existing in the architecture of institutions: the orphanage, the convent, the juvenile facility, the prison, the maximum security cell, the glass box in court. He was shaped by those institutions and then unleashed on a world that had never been prepared for what they produced. He moved through Argentina, leaving permanent damage at every point of contact. Bodies, scars, grief, and a legal record so catastrophically weighted that it bends the mind to hold it all at once. He is the 2nd longest-serving prisoner in Argentina's history, a distinction he shares with no one except the gravity of his own crimes. The case of Roberto José Carmona, La Hiena Humana, the human hyena, is not a story about a monster from another world. It is a story about what happens at the intersection of abandonment, institutional failure, untreated violence, and a system that repeatedly offered small mercies to a man who had proven, again and again, that mercy was not something he understood. It is a story about Gabriela Seppi, who was 16 and standing by the side of a road and never got home. About Javier Bacalin, who was driving a cab on a football afternoon and never finished his shift. Their names are the ones that matter. The hyena's name is only a vehicle for getting there. The cage holds him now. The glass is thick. And in Argentina, the families of 4 people who never came home wait. not for justice, which has already been rendered in all its insufficient weight, but simply for time to pass. Simply for the end of a story that should never have been as long as it was. If you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where true crime is told with calm and care. A huge thank you to the subscribers who've been here from the start. Your support means everything. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, or just say hello. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into our second story. Story 2. El Mataprisos, the one-eyed butcher of Mendoza. The bloodiest secret Argentina kept behind prison walls, aka El Tuerto, Gordo Picuru, the prisoner killer. Some men are sent to prison to be punished. Diego Casanova went to prison and turned it into his hunting ground. Picture a man so savage, so utterly hollow of conscience, that the most hardened criminals in Argentina, murderers, kidnappers, men who had done unspeakable things on the outside, trembled at the sound of his name echoing down a prison corridor. A man who did not simply commit violence, but appeared to crave it the way ordinary people crave sunlight. A man who could beat a teenager to death with a homemade crowbar, watch the blood spread across the floor, and in the next breath ask a guard, calmly, almost cheerfully, whether anyone had come to visit him that day. Not a flicker of remorse, not a tremor of guilt, just a mild annoyance that his shirt had been ruined. That is Diego Roberto Casanova Trigo, and what you are about to hear did not happen in the darkness of some underground dungeon. It happened inside the Argentine penal system year after year, while officials struggled to contain a creature they could barely understand. This is not fiction. Every drop of blood you are about to encounter is real. The province of Mendoza sits at the foot of the Andes Mountains in western Argentina, a land of vineyards, dry winds, and long silences between settlements. It is a place of extraordinary natural beauty, the kind of landscape that makes people believe in something larger than themselves. But tucked inside Mendoza's quieter corners, away from the wine routes and tourist trails, are neighborhoods where survival has always meant something sharper and more brutal than anything printed on a postcard. It was in one of these corners, a modest locality called Tropero Sosa in the municipality of Maipú, that Diego Roberto Casanova Trigo entered the world in 1980. Nobody who knew him as a child could point to a single moment and say, "There, that was when it began." Evil rarely announces itself. It settles in slowly, like a stain working its way through fabric, invisible at first, unmistakable by the time anyone thinks to look. What is known is that Casanova grew up in a modest environment with limited prospects and even more limited restraint. From an early age, he gravitated toward the wrong corners, the wrong crowds, the kinds of alleys where young men learn to take what they need and feel nothing about it afterward. The neighborhood gave him his first nickname, Gordo Picuru, a crude, street-level tag that translates roughly to something between the fat one and the troublesome one. Stuck. It described him accurately. He was known as a problem before he was known as a predator. Petty theft came first. Robberies, street-level crimes, the kind of low-stakes wrongdoing that the Argentine judicial system processes every day without much drama. Casanova drifted through these years, accumulating a reputation but avoiding serious consequence. He was arrested briefly in 2004 for robbery and released within weeks. A routine outcome that, in hindsight, would carry the weight of catastrophic irony. Because in the weeks that followed his release, Diego Casanova did not reflect on his choices. He did not seek a different path. He picked up where he left off, and this time things went much further than theft. October 14, 2004. The Barrio Mexico neighborhood of Maipú. It was meant to be a simple home invasion, the kind of crime that Argentine police files document by the thousands. Casanova and an accomplice had selected a target, scoped the property, and moved in under the cover of the evening. What they had not fully prepared for was the homeowner waking up. Francisco Quevedo was 67 years old, a retiree, A man who had lived a long life and was sleeping in his own home on an ordinary night when two men broke in with the intention of taking whatever they could find. When Quevedo stirred, when his eyes opened and the dark shapes in his home became real, the calculation for Casanova was immediate and cold. There was no hesitation, no attempt to flee, no moment of human recognition between the two men. Casanova produced a blade and stabbed Francisco Quevedo to death. What happened after the killing reveals something deeply unsettling about the architecture of Casanova's mind, something that would repeat itself in different forms throughout the years that followed. Rather than panicking or fleeing, Casanova and his accomplice staged the scene. They lifted Quevedo's body, placed it on a couch, and draped a blanket carefully across his lap, as though arranging a sleeping man for a portrait. The gesture was not compassion. It was a coldly practical attempt to delay discovery, to make a dead body look like a resting one. They wanted time. They wanted to disappear. The staging was methodical, even theatrical. It did not work. A 12-year-old girl in the neighborhood had seen what she should never have had to see. She went to the police. That same day, Casanova was arrested. Within the machinery of the Argentine courts, he was tried and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was transferred to the Boulogne-sur-Mer Correctional Facility in Mendoza. For most people, a 20-year sentence is a reckoning, a brutal, extended punishment that reshapes the person who endures it. Time in prison grinds against the self in ways that are difficult to articulate. The loss of autonomy, the compression of space, the constant negotiation between survival and dignity. For Diego Casanova, the experience produced something different. It seemed to sharpen him, to clarify something in him that civilian life had left blurred. Behind bars, Casanova discovered what he was good at. And what he was good at was terrifying people and killing them. The Boulogne-sur-Mer prison was not a gentle institution. Argentine correctional facilities have long struggled with overcrowding, understaffing, and the brutal internal economies that develop when human beings are concentrated in confined spaces without adequate oversight. Violence was not rare. Fights were common. The hierarchy among inmates was enforced with fists and blades and the accumulated weight of reputation. In this environment, Casanova thrived. He was physically imposing, psychologically unreadable, and possessed of a willingness to escalate that made him genuinely terrifying. Other inmates learned quickly. Do not cross him. Do not challenge him. Do not attract his attention. He fought constantly. Prison records would eventually document 67 separate fights involving Diego Casanova. A number so extraordinary that it reads less like a disciplinary file and more like a combat tally. 67. In an environment where even one fight could get a prisoner isolated or transferred, Casanova accumulated those altercations the way other men accumulate years on a sentence. Each one was a message. Each one was a reminder of what he was and what he was capable of. The fights were not always about anything specific. Not debts, not territory, not insults to be avenged. Some of them seemed to exist simply because Casanova needed them to, as though the violence itself was the point. But the fights were merely the atmosphere, the backdrop, the evidence that the man walking these corridors was operating on a frequency that ordinary prison violence could barely contain. What was coming? What had already begun to form in Casanova's mind as he paced the enclosed world of Boulogne-sur-Mer was something far beyond 67 fights. It was murder, planned, repeated, carried out with a chilling level of calm that would leave Argentine criminologists reaching for new frameworks to describe what they were witnessing. Experts who later examined Casanova's behavior pattern arrived at a cluster of words: psychopathic, antisocial, extremely dangerous. These were not casual assessments. These were clinical evaluations by professionals who had spent careers studying violent offenders and who found in Casanova something that sat at an extreme edge even within that dark spectrum. The conclusion was direct. Diego Casanova was one of the cruelest serial killers in the recorded history of Argentina. That verdict did not come from the first murder alone. It came from everything that followed. The accumulation, the pattern, the way each killing seemed to cost him nothing. Not sleep, not appetite, not composure. In the months and years that stretched ahead of him behind those walls, Diego Casanova would kill again and again and again. Not because he was provoked beyond reason. Not because he was fighting for his life. But because the walls contained him, and within those walls, he had found the only power that seemed to mean anything to him. The power to end someone. But before we reach those crimes, before we walk through each of those murders in the detail they deserve, it is worth pausing here at the beginning. At the couch in Barrio Mexico, the folded blanket, the 67-year-old man who went to sleep and never woke up. At the 12-year-old girl who saw what she saw and found the courage to speak. At the routine arrest and the standard sentence and the transfer to a facility that would become, over the following 12 years, a place of calculated, relentless, systematic slaughter. Francisco Quevedo was the first. He would not be the last. Not by 5. And the road from Quevedo's living room to the blood-soaked conclusion of this story runs through some of the darkest territory in Argentine criminal history. It runs through riots and hostages and inmates stabbed in their sleep. It runs through a young man who believed that sharing a cell with Diego Casanova would keep him safe, and paid for that belief with his life. It runs through the story of a man the prison system could not contain, could not rehabilitate, and could barely survive. A man who, even today, sits in solitary confinement behind maximum security walls, medicated and isolated and watched, because even now, the system that holds him is not entirely sure what would happen if it stopped. His name is Diego Roberto Casanova Trigo. They call him El Mataprisos, the prisoner killer. And all of this is only the beginning. There is a particular cruelty to being murdered inside a prison. Outside, victims have the whole geography of the world to run through. Streets and parks and distant cities and the possibility of disappearance. Inside, there is nowhere to go. The walls define the universe. Every face is a familiar one. Every sound is recognizable. And when death comes, it comes from someone who has been standing just a few meters away for weeks or months. Someone who has eaten in the same room and slept on the same block. Inside prison, murder is intimate in a way that makes it almost unbearably sinister. Diego Casanova understood this, perhaps more than any other person confined within Argentina's Mendoza correctional system. He grasped the particular power that proximity offered. He was not a man who killed at a distance, in bursts of uncontrolled rage that subsided as quickly as they began. He was a man who watched, who waited, who allowed time and circumstance to arrange themselves into the exact configuration he required, and then moved with a speed and certainty that gave his victims almost no chance to understand what was happening to them before it was over. By 2006, Casanova had been inside Boulogne-sur-Mer for 2 years. His reputation was well established. The 67 fights were not yet 67, the count was still building, but the message had been delivered clearly enough. He was not a man to challenge. He was not a man to cross. And it was becoming apparent to those paying attention, not a man who had any intention of serving 20 years quietly. Then came June of 2006, and with it, 2 names, Diego Ferranti and Gerardo Gomez. These 2 men had nothing in common with Casanova in the biographical sense. They were not products of the same streets, the same background, the same formative years. What they had in common with Casanova was purely situational. They had all ended up inside the same correctional system. But Ferranti and Gomez carried something with them that, in the logic of the prison world, made them extraordinarily vulnerable. They were witnesses. They had participated in a riot at another facility, and they had done something that the prison code treats as an unforgivable act. They had agreed to testify. In the enclosed world of Argentine correctional institutions, the decision to cooperate with authorities carries a price that outsiders sometimes struggle to fully grasp. It is not merely social disapproval. It is not simply a damaged reputation. It is frequently a death sentence, the kind delivered not in a courtroom but in a corridor or a cell or a moment when the guards are occupied elsewhere. The prison authorities knew this. When Ferranti and Gomez agreed to testify, the system made the decision to transfer them to Boulogne-sur-Mer for their own protection. The logic was sound. Move them away from the prison where they were known, give them distance from the people they were testifying against, place them somewhere that offered safety through separation. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. On June 17, 2006, the day after Ferranti and Gomez arrived at Boulogne-sur-Mer. Diego Casanova and 3 accomplices stabbed both men to death. The killings were executed with a deliberate, organized brutality that spoke volumes about the planning involved. Casanova had learned of their arrival and their status almost immediately. The prison grapevine, that invisible, relentless network of information that flows through any enclosed population, had delivered the relevant details before the new inmates had even had time to orient themselves in their new surroundings. Ferranti and Gomez had barely settled before the decision was made about them. After the murders, Casanova and his collaborators wrapped both bodies in sheets. That detail, the wrapping, the packaging of the dead, appears again in this story, as it will appear again. It is one of those recurring gestures that investigators and criminologists would later point to as revelatory of character. There is something in the act of wrapping a body that suggests a relationship to the dead that goes beyond panic or guilt. It is organizational. It is, in its own terrible way, almost tidy. The bodies were contained. The scene was managed. The act had been committed, and now it needed to be processed. Casanova was, in these moments, not spiraling. He was functioning. The motive for these murders has never been definitively established. Ferranti and Gomez had not wronged Casanova personally. They were not enemies from a previous conflict. The leading interpretation among those who studied the case is that the killings were either contracted, performed at someone else's request in exchange for some form of currency within the prison economy, or that Casanova viewed the murder of witnesses as an ideological act, a declaration of where he stood within the prison world's moral framework. Either explanation is deeply chilling in its own way. If the murders were contracted, they establish Casanova as a man willing to kill strangers for prison world compensation. If they were ideological, they reveal something darker still. A man who killed to send a message, to position himself, to carve out a reputation in a world where reputation was enforced in blood. The Argentine courts moved on these crimes. Casanova and his 3 accomplices were sentenced to life in prison. The first of what would become, in Casanova's case, an accumulating series of life sentences. This is worth pausing on. A life sentence in Argentina is meant to represent the endpoint of the judicial response to extreme violence. It is the system's declaration that no further punishment can be conceived. Casanova received one and kept killing. The sentence did not slow him. It did not alter his behavior. It added to the arithmetic of his incarceration without changing anything about the man serving it. 5 months after the murders of Ferranti and Gomez, on November 27, 2006, Casanova killed again. José Manuel Cruz was an inmate at Boulogne-sur-Mer serving a sentence for assault. He had arrived at the facility approximately 1 month before his death. He had not, as far as anyone could establish, done anything to provoke Diego Casanova. He had not crossed him, threatened him, or entered into any conflict with him. He was simply there in the same space, and Casanova had apparently decided that he would not continue to be. Cruz was asleep when Casanova came for him. Sleep is the most vulnerable state a human being can occupy. The body relaxed, the defenses down, the mind absent from the scene of what is about to unfold. Casanova wrapped a sheet around Cruz's sleeping body. That gesture again, that enclosing, restraining motion, and stabbed him 20 times. 20. The repetition of the blade, the commitment of the act, the sheer number of wounds. This was not an impulsive lashing out. This was sustained. This was someone who had decided that a thing needed to be done thoroughly. When it was finished, Casanova dragged Cruz's body to the door of the pavilion and left it there. Not hidden, not arranged. Left at the threshold, visible, positioned where it would be found and seen. Another message. Another declaration written in the only language Casanova seemed to genuinely trust. The subsequent investigation and prosecution resulted in an additional 12 years added to Casanova's sentence, stacked on top of the existing 20-year sentence and the life sentence already handed down for the murders of Ferranti and Gomez. From the outside, this accumulation of punishment reads like escalating severity. From the inside, from Casanova's position, it is difficult to identify what the incremental additions were meant to accomplish. He was already serving more time than any human lifespan could contain. The extra years had no practical meaning. They were judicial notation, a record of crimes acknowledged by the state. What they did not do, what no sentencing in this story would ever do, was stop Diego Casanova. The prison authorities were now dealing with a prisoner who had killed 3 people inside their facilities within a 5-month window. The threat assessment was undeniable. Casanova was violent, organized, capable of recruiting accomplices, and apparently indifferent to whatever legal consequences his actions generated. The system's response to this kind of prisoner typically involves heightened security, increased surveillance, and restrictions on movement and contact. Whether these measures were implemented adequately in the years that followed is a question the later murders would answer with devastating clarity. Because the timeline of Diego Casanova's crimes does not end in 2006. It continues into 2010, into 2016, each chapter more disturbing in some ways than the last. Not necessarily because the mechanics of the killings become more elaborate, but because of what they demonstrate about the limits of institutional control when the person being contained has no functional relationship to consequences, to punishment, to the incentive structures that keep most people within the boundaries of behavior. What had already happened? Quevedo in the living room, Ferranti and Gomez wrapped in sheets, Cruz stabbed 20 times while sleeping, was the foundation of a portrait. The full image was still being painted, and the colors it would take on in the next decade would grow darker and stranger and more unsettling with each new detail added. Casanova was, at this point in the story, in his mid-20s. A young man by most measures. A young man serving multiple consecutive sentences that stretched mathematically far beyond his expected lifespan. A young man in a maximum security environment, surrounded by guards and walls and systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of thing he kept doing. And somehow, against all of that institutional weight, he kept doing it. The next murder would not come for 4 years. 4 years in which Diego Casanova existed inside the Argentine prison system, fighting his 67 recorded fights, building his reputation, carrying his accumulated sentences the way other men carry old injuries. Waiting, whether consciously or not, for the next moment to arrive. When it arrived in a riot. There are men who react to circumstances, and then there are men who manufacture them. By 2010, Diego Casanova had been inside the Argentine prison system for 6 years. He had killed 3 people. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment. He had fought 60-something recorded fights and countless unrecorded ones. He was, by every professional assessment, a profoundly dangerous individual with no discernible path toward behavioral change. The institution that held him, now Almafuerte prison in Cashuta, Mendoza, where he had been transferred, was a maximum security facility, a place designed to house exactly the kind of person Casanova had proven himself to be. And still it was not enough. April 24, 2010, began like most days inside Almafuerte, with the mechanical routine of a facility that processes human beings through time with the grinding predictability of heavy industry. Guards on shift, inmates in their assigned spaces, the ambient noise of a large population living in close, uncomfortable proximity. Nothing on the surface to suggest that something had been set in motion that morning that would end with a man stabbed more than 10 times and a riot used as a murder weapon. Casanova had been thinking. That is perhaps the most chilling aspect of what unfolded. Not the violence itself, which by now carried a grim familiarity, but the planning that preceded it. The architecture of deception he had constructed. Because what happened on April 24th was not spontaneous. It was choreographed. One of Casanova's collaborators, an inmate working in concert with him, feigned a seizure. The performance was convincing enough that 5 prison guards responded. This is what guards are trained to do, what they are morally and professionally obligated to do. Respond to a medical emergency with speed and care. They opened the cell. They entered. And the moment they crossed that threshold, the ruse collapsed into reality and the violence began. 4 inmates seized the guards and took them hostage. 5 correctional officers, men who had arrived to help a sick prisoner, were now captives, leverage in a scheme that had never been about a medical emergency at all. The hostages were the diversion. They were the key that unlocked the chaos Casanova needed. With the guards subdued and the facility in the grinding turmoil of a riot, With attention and resources redirected toward the hostage situation and the spreading disorder, Casanova moved. He and his two accomplices, Mario Lorca and Sergio Barroso Oliveras, had already secured blades. In the commotion of a prison riot, where the ordinary systems of control are stretched and strained and sometimes shattered, weapons that would normally be confiscated find their way into willing hands. Casanova had his. He knew where he was going. The target was Dario Vega Gonzalez, 35 years old, serving an 18-year sentence for sexual abuse. Gonzalez was in his cell. The riot was happening around him. The guards who might otherwise have stood between him and what was coming had been neutralized by the hostage situation. The chaos that Casanova had engineered with surgical precision was working exactly as intended. And in the midst of that chaos, Casanova and his accomplices reached Gonzalez's cell and stabbed him more than 10 times. The riot lasted approximately 7 hours. 7 hours of manufactured disorder that had been designed, from the outset, to provide the cover and the opportunity for one specific act of killing. When it was over, when the violence had exhausted itself and the system began the slow process of reasserting control, Casanova did something unexpected. He and the others freed the hostage guards. They turned themselves in. He was calm, matter of fact. He stated, when questioned, that the purpose of the riot had been to attract attention so that he would be transferred to a different prison. He wanted a change of scenery, and he had been willing to organize a 7-hour hostage situation, manufacture a riot, and stab a man more than 10 times to get it. Let that settle for a moment. The logic, if it can be called that, has a disturbing internal coherence. Casanova wanted something. He identified what needed to happen to get it. He assembled the necessary components. A collaborator willing to fake a seizure, accomplices willing to take guards hostage, blades to carry out the main event. The killing of Dario Vega Gonzalez earned Diego Casanova his second life sentence. He now held 2 life sentences, a 20-year sentence, and 12 additional years. The numbers had passed into abstraction. They meant nothing in any practical sense. They were judicial sculpture, impressively constructed, entirely non-functional as deterrents. The detail about Gonzalez's crime, that he was serving time for sexual abuse, has been noted in various accounts of this case, sometimes with the implication that Casanova's targeting of him carried some rough moral logic, that the prison code's brutal treatment of sex offenders might explain or contextualize the choice of victim. This is worth addressing carefully and honestly. Gonzalez was targeted because he was accessible, because the riot provided cover, and perhaps because his specific conviction made him an easier mark. Less likely to have allies, less likely to trigger retaliation among the wider prison population. Whether Casanova felt any particular ideology about the matter is unknown. What is certain is that the murder was executed with the same cold efficiency as the others, and that the victim's crime offered Casanova no more moral cover than any killer ever achieves by selecting vulnerable targets. After Gonzalez, Casanova continued accumulating his fights. The number climbed toward 67 and beyond. He was transferred, eventually, as he had wanted, moved through the system, watched more closely, managed with increasing desperation by a correctional apparatus that was running out of effective responses to what he represented. The medications came, anxiolytics, pharmaceutical attempts to smooth the edges of a personality that professionals described in terms that left little room for optimism. Psychopathic, antisocial, extremely dangerous. In April 2012, 6 years into his accumulating life sentences, Casanova was involved in another violent altercation, this one with consequences that would alter his appearance permanently. Another inmate stabbed him in the left eye with a knife. The wound was devastating. Casanova lost the eye entirely. The loss of an eye in prison in a fight with another inmate is the kind of event that carries multiple registers of meaning simultaneously. It is physical damage. Painful, disfiguring, the permanent removal of half a man's visual field. It is also, in the world Casanova inhabited, a statement. Someone had gotten close enough, had been committed enough, had struck with enough precision to take something irreplaceable. Casanova had been marked. He had been injured in a way that couldn't be undone. His response to this was not retreat or recalibration. His response was to absorb it. to wear the wound as a new identity. The neighborhood nickname, Gordo Picuru, was retired. The prison world gave him a new one, El Tuerto, the one-eyed. It was not a sympathetic nickname. It was a description of something that had survived, had been damaged and kept going, had taken a blade to the face and continued to be exactly what it had always been. One-eyed, medicated, serving 2 life sentences and change, Diego Casanova sat inside the Argentine correctional system, and the system sat around him, and somewhere in the following years, 4 of them, for years of solitary confinement and medication and the particular quality of silence that settles around a man that everyone has agreed is irredeemable, the story moved toward its final documented chapter. A 17-year-old boy was serving time for kidnapping and murder. His name was Andres Penaloza. He was young, newly arrived in a world where youth and inexperience are vulnerabilities that the surrounding predatory hierarchy identifies immediately and exploits without sentiment. Penaloza was afraid. This is entirely understandable. He was a teenager in a maximum security facility populated by men whose capacity for violence had been certified multiple times over. The fear was rational. The decision he made in response to that fear was not. Andres Penaloza requested to be moved into Diego Casanova's cell. The request sounds, from the outside, like a kind of terrible dark irony, a joke written by someone with no sense of proportion and no regard for human life. A teenager, frightened of the violent men around him, choosing to room with the most violent man in the facility, choosing the wolf for protection against the wolves. But inside the enclosed, pressurized logic of the prison world, the decision was not irrational on its own terms. It was a calculated bet, a strategic move based on a simple and not entirely incorrect analysis of how power works in that environment. Diego Casanova was, by 2016, the most feared man in the Mendoza correctional system, possibly the most feared man in the Argentine prison system as a whole. His name carried weight that extended far beyond Almafuerte, far beyond Boulogne-sur-Mer, far beyond any single facility where he had served time or committed violence. He was a known quantity, a verified, documented, court-sentenced killer with 2 life sentences and a body count that had been meticulously recorded in police files and court transcripts. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of Diego Casanova. Nobody wanted to attract his attention. Andres Penaloza's thinking, as far as it can be reconstructed, went something like this: if I am Casanova's cellmate, I am under his protection. The other inmates will not touch me. The violence that circulates through this place like a current will route around me, because it will route around him. I will be safe inside the orbit of the most dangerous person here. It was a bet made in fear. It was a bet made by a 17-year-old navigating an environment for which nothing in his life could have prepared him. It was, in the most devastating way possible, the wrong bet. Penaloza was moved into Casanova's cell. The coexistence began. For 45 days, the arrangement appeared to hold. Penaloza was, from available accounts, treating the situation carefully, maintaining the relationship, not causing friction, staying in the good graces of a man whose good graces were, at best, a temporary and contingent state. 45 days in a shared cell with Diego Casanova. The proximity of it is difficult to fully imagine. The enforced closeness, the lack of any exit, the constant management of a relationship with someone whose history had already demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of losing his approval. We do not know exactly what passed between them in those 45 days. We do not know what conversations happened in that cell, what tensions accumulated, what small moments of friction or misunderstanding built into something larger. What we know is that on May 29, 2016, it ended. Casanova picked up a makeshift crowbar, a length of metal fashioned into a weapon from materials available within the prison environment, the improvised armory of incarcerated men, where the capacity for violence is rarely constrained by the absence of conventional weapons. He used it to bludgeon Andres Penaloza to death. Bludgeoning is a different act from stabbing. It requires sustained physical engagement, repeated blows, a commitment to the action that carries its own terrible quality. A person being beaten to death does not fall immediately. They struggle. They raise their arms. They try to move. The killer must continue, must bring the weapon down again and again against a living, resisting person, must absorb the sounds and the sensations of what they are doing and keep going until the resistance stops. It is, in terms of the physical reality of the experience, one of the most intimate and sustained forms of killing. Casanova beat Penaloza to death in the cell the boy had requested specifically because he thought it would protect him. When it was over, when the guards were alerted and the response teams arrived and the documentation of another murder in Diego Casanova's file began, investigators noted his demeanor. They noted it because it was remarkable even in the context of everything that had come before. Casanova was not agitated. He was not in the grip of whatever emotion, rage, adrenaline, fear, had presumably driven the attack. He was composed. He was, by multiple accounts, more preoccupied with two specific practical concerns than with anything related to the dead teenager on the floor of his cell. He wanted to know whether anyone had come to visit him that day, and he was irritated about his clothes. Penaloza's blood had gotten on them. The ruination of his clothes was, in that moment, a more pressing concern than the body they were standing near. This detail, this extraordinary window into the abyss detail, is the one that lodged most deeply in the memories of the officials and investigators who processed the scene and the aftermath. It is the detail that appears most consistently in the accounts of those who studied Diego Casanova's psychology. Because it does not describe a man in the grip of psychotic break, or a man drowning in the consequences of what he had just done, or even a man performing indifference as a shield against something real happening underneath. It describes a man for whom the killing had generated no internal weight at all, no reverberation, no echo. The boy was dead and the concern was the shirt. Forensic psychologists and criminal behavior experts who reviewed Casanova's full file, the 6 murders, the 67 fights, the riots, the escalating sentences, the consistent pattern of organized and purposeful violence, described what they saw in terms that cluster around one central clinical concept: the complete absence of empathy. Not reduced empathy, not blunted empathy, this complete absence. The machinery that connects most human beings to the suffering of others, that makes another person's pain feel like something relevant, something that matters, something that imposes cost on the person causing it, appeared, in Casanova's case, to be simply not there. This is not a moral judgment in the theological sense. It is a clinical observation about the architecture of a particular human mind, and it is, to anyone who pauses with it, a genuinely terrifying thing to contemplate. Because the violence that Diego Casanova committed over 12 years, from Francisco Quevedo's living room in 2004 to Andres Penaloza's cell in 2016, was not the product of overwhelming emotion. It was not passion or grief or the kind of explosive human fury that most people can at least locate within themselves even if they have never acted on it. It was something colder, something quieter, something that did not keep Casanova up at night or disturb his appetite or make him ask for visitors after the fact because some part of him needed human reassurance. He asked for visitors because he wanted company. The blood on the shirt was a laundry problem. The boy on the floor was a consequence he had already filed away and moved past before the guards had even finished crossing the threshold. In the aftermath of Penaloza's murder, the Argentine prison system made a decision it had arguably been building toward for years. Diego Casanova was placed in permanent solitary confinement, not as a temporary disciplinary measure, but as a structural reality, an acknowledgement that the normal frameworks of prison management were not adequate for what he represented. The solitary cell is, in a sense, the system's white flag. It is the institutional admission that no rehabilitative or punitive infrastructure exists that can contain this person in any conventional way. The only answer is isolation. The only answer is walls between him and every other living person in the facility. He remains there today. Medicated, the anxiolytics prescribed by the professionals who assessed him represent an attempt to pharmacologically manage what behavioral intervention has failed to reach. Watched. Classified under maximum security protocols that reflect the ongoing, undimmed assessment of what he is capable of. The 2 life sentences and the additional years sit in his file as a kind of legal monument, a record of the state's accumulating formal response to a man who has generated more formal responses than most prisoners accumulate in their entire incarceration. 6 confirmed murders. Francisco Quevedo, 67, stabbed in his own home. Diego Ferranti and Gerardo Gomez, wrapped in sheets and killed within 24 hours of arriving at a facility intended to protect them. Jose Manuel Cruz, stabbed 20 times while sleeping. Dario Vega Gonzalez, stabbed more than 10 times in the middle of a riot that Casanova had staged specifically to reach him. Andres Penaloza, beaten to death with a homemade weapon in the cell he had specifically requested for his own safety. 6 lives. 6 completely individual human beings, each with their own histories and families and the ordinary daily texture of a person alive in the world. Each reduced by the same set of hands to a name in a police file and a date in a courtroom record. And behind each name, the same figure. A man from Maipú, from the modest streets of Tropero Sosa, who became Gordo Picuru and then El Mataprisos and then El Tuerto, who accumulated nicknames the way he accumulated victims and sentences, each one marking a new chapter of the same unrelenting story. Argentina's criminal history contains many figures who achieved notoriety through violence, many cases that challenged the country's understanding of what human beings are capable of. Diego Casanova sits at an extreme edge of that history, not because his victim count is the highest of any offender in the national record, but because of the particular quality of his crimes, the environment in which they occurred, and the profile that emerges from the totality of the evidence. He killed inside the one place that was supposed to be the answer to killing. He used the prison, its geography, its social structure, its systems of routine and response, as his hunting ground and his stage. He involved accomplices not out of weakness, but because he could recruit them, because his reputation was currency that other inmates were willing to spend in exchange for proximity to his protection or his approval. He manufactured riots as infrastructure for homicide. He faked medical emergencies as operational cover. He wrapped bodies in sheets and left them at pavilion doors and asked guards about his visitors as he stood in rooms still warm from the violence he had just completed. The Argentine judicial system, having exhausted its formal responses, keeps him in a cell alone. The professionals who monitor him write reports that describe a man who is not changed, who shows no trajectory toward change, who represents a continued and genuine risk to anyone within reach of him. The medication manages symptoms. It does not address the root. There is no intervention in the existing clinical literature, no therapeutic framework, no correctional program that has produced documented success with individuals whose profile matches Casanova's at the severity level he occupies. So he sits, one eye gone, taken by a blade in 2012. 2 life sentences and counting in his file, 44 or 45 years old, depending on where in 1980 his birthday falls. A man who has now spent roughly half of his life incarcerated, the entirety of his adult existence inside the walls that were supposed to punish him and that instead became the theater in which he committed most of his crimes. The 6 families carry the weight of what he did to them. Francisco Quevedo's family carries the image of a 67-year-old man arranged on his couch with a blanket on his lap, staged by the man who had just stabbed him to death. The families of Ferranti and Gomez carry the knowledge that their loved ones were transferred to safety and killed the following day. Cruz's family carries 20 stab wounds. Gonzalez's family carries a riot that was a performance, a seizure that was a deception, 7 hours of manufactured chaos that served as the mechanism for a predetermined death. Penaloza's family carries a 17-year-old boy who made a desperate, frightened decision and never made another one. And somewhere inside the maximum security wing of an Argentine prison, one-eyed and medicated and alone, Diego Roberto Casanova Trigo, El Mataprisos, El Tuerto, the man the Argentine correctional system cannot contain and cannot release, waits out the remaining years of a life already defined, with absolute completeness, by what he chose to do with the years he had. The walls that were meant to punish him became the walls that made him. He is still there. He is not going anywhere. And the only mercy in any of this, the only thing in this entire story that approaches anything like relief, is that the walls at last are permanent. This has been the case of Diego Roberto Casanova Trigo, Argentina's most feared prisoner killer, a man the system could not break and could not afford to free. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Ghost of the Pampas, a Killer Without a Conscience. Juan Catalino Dominguez, a.k.a. El Peon del Diablo, the Devil's Ranch Hand. Picture a man lying in a hospital bed, a bullet lodged in his leg, his wife gone, his daughter taken, his dignity shattered on a stranger's bedroom floor, and instead of breaking down, instead of weeping, instead of surrendering to grief the way most men do, he simply goes very, very quiet. He stares at the ceiling. He breathes slowly, and somewhere behind those still, dark eyes, something that was once human folds itself away, never to return. What replaces it is colder, more patient, and far more terrifying than anything grief alone could manufacture. What replaces it is something the Buenos Aires countryside would come to know in whispers, in locked doors, in the way farmers check twice over their shoulders before stepping outside after dark. What replaces it has a name, but the name barely matters because the name kept changing. He was Donato Aguirre on one farm, Pedro Montenegro on another, Pedro Aguirre somewhere else entirely. He was nobody and everywhere at once, drifting across the flat, wind-swept pampas of southeast Buenos Aires province like a shadow that the land itself could not shake loose. He was Juan Catalino Dominguez, and between 1944 and 1948, he killed 8 people, escaped police custody multiple times, used his own child as cover while hunting his enemies, and ultimately forced law enforcement into a fatal shootout on a cold April morning that finally, permanently, ended the nightmare. This is not a story about a monster born in darkness. This is something more disturbing, a story about a man who chose it, step by step, blade by blade, bullet by bullet. Welcome to the Pampas, where the grass grows tall, the distances are merciless, and a killer can disappear for years in plain sight. To understand what Juan Catalino Dominguez became, you must first understand what he was before the blood. Born on May 4, 1910, in the small, unremarkable town of Rauch, in the Buenos Aires province of Argentina, Catalino entered the world in a place where vast flat plains stretched to every horizon, where cattle outnumbered people, and where a man's worth was measured almost entirely by the calluses on his hands and the steadiness of his word. The Pampas were not a forgiving landscape. They demanded endurance, self-sufficiency, and a particular brand of hardened silence from the men who worked them. Catalino would go on to master that silence more completely than anyone around him, though not in the way the land intended. Very little is documented about his earliest years. Histories and records of rural Argentina in the early 20th century were rarely meticulous about the lives of working-class men, and Catalino left no notable trace in the public record during his childhood or adolescence. What is known is that by 1933, when he was in his early 20s, he had already drifted into petty criminality, committing thefts in the rural areas surrounding Ayacucho and Coronel Vidal. These were not grand crimes. They were the scraping, opportunistic offenses of a man without much direction and without whatever internal governor keeps most people from crossing the line between want and taking. He stole. He moved on. He was not yet dangerous, not in the way he would become. He was simply a man already on the wrong side of the moral ledger, accumulating small debts to society that nobody was yet keeping serious track of. By the late 1930s, Catalino had drifted to the coastal city of Mar del Plata, a prosperous and vibrant Atlantic resort town that pulsed with a different energy from the isolated ranchland he had grown up near. Mar del Plata was alive with commerce, casinos, tourists, and the particular restlessness of a city that never quite slept. He found work there as a chauffeur, a job that required a certain presentability, some mechanical knowledge, and the ability to be trusted in close proximity to employers and their property. It is worth pausing on that word, trusted, because the story of Catalino Dominguez is, in many ways, a story about the catastrophic consequences of being trusted by and trusting the wrong people. In Mar del Plata, something happened. The records are not entirely specific about its precise nature, but it was described as an altercation serious enough to land him in prison. From 1940 to 1943, he was incarcerated, 3 years stripped away from his life in the prime of his 30s. Prison in Argentina in that era was not a rehabilitative institution. It was a warehouse for inconvenient people, and what it produced in Catalino, whatever slow simmering of resentment, whatever hardening of his already inflexible temperament, can only be speculated at. What is certain is that when he came out, he appeared to make a genuine attempt at normalcy. By 1944, Catalino had secured work as the caretaker of a luxurious private residence in the La Loma de Stella Maris neighborhood of Mar del Plata, one of the city's more affluent coastal districts, where large homes sat behind manicured hedges and the sea breeze carried the faint perfume of privilege. He was living there with his 18-year-old wife, Isabel, who was born Isabel Criado, and their young daughter, Marta. This was his life now: a caretaker's position, a young wife, a child, a modest but stable existence in a beautiful setting. Whatever storms had previously rolled through his biography appeared, at least from the outside, to have passed. He was friendly enough with people in his immediate circle, and it was in the spirit of that friendliness that he invited an acquaintance named Rafael Luchetti to stay at the residence. Luchetti was a friend, or at least a man Catalino believed to be a friend. He offered his hospitality. He shared his roof. And it is here, in this ordinary act of trust extended to the wrong person, that everything fractures. One day, Catalino came home, or entered a room he had no reason to think twice about entering, and found Rafael Luchetti in bed with Isabel, his wife, his 18-year-old wife, with their daughter somewhere nearby in that same house. The details of what Catalino felt in that precise moment are not recorded because they did not need to be. Anyone who has ever experienced the specific, searing devastation of betrayal, particularly a betrayal compounded by a guest's violation of the most fundamental hospitality, can fill in those details without assistance. What happened next unfolded with a savage swiftness that would define the entire arc of what was to come. Catalino did not simply freeze or weep or walk back out of the room. He moved, aggressively, with his fists, throwing himself at Luchetti in a raw, unthinking explosion of fury. But Luchetti was prepared in a way that Catalino was not. The man pulled out a revolver, and he shot Catalino in the leg. While Catalino collapsed to the ground, writhing and bleeding, Luchetti grabbed Isabel and little Marta, bundled them into a car, and drove away. The man who had been a guest in Catalino's home left that home with Catalino's wife and child, having just shot the man who had fed and housed him. By the time anyone reached Catalino and transported him to a nearby hospital, Luchetti was gone, and the life Catalino had been building was gone with him. It is impossible to know what runs through a person's mind during a hospital recovery after something like this. The physical pain of a gunshot wound is considerable: the shattering of bone, the tearing of tissue, the slow and grinding process of healing. But the psychological wound Catalino carried out of that hospital bed was of an entirely different order. He did not emerge from the hospital softened. He did not emerge confused or broken or willing to absorb this humiliation and move forward. He emerged with a single, consuming obsession, one that would dictate his every move for the next 4 years and drag 8 people to their graves. He was going to find Rafael Luchetti, and he was going to kill him. What followed immediately upon his discharge from hospital was a period of patient, calculating surveillance. Catalino had learned, through whatever network of local knowledge and rumor he had access to, that Luchetti's mother, a widow named Gregoria Roses, lived in the town of Dolores, a farming community roughly 200 kilometers south of Buenos Aires. His logic was simple and cold. Sooner or later, a man visits his mother, so Catalino went to Dolores. He set himself up on the outskirts of the town, in a small shed, living with the bare minimum and supporting himself by doing odd jobs for a local man named Jamie Casanova. He kept a low profile. He made himself useful, and he watched. He began frequenting the home of Gregoria Roses and her common-law husband, Narciso Penalba, presenting himself as a harmless drifter doing piecework in the area. He was gathering intelligence. He was positioning himself. He was waiting, But Luchetti didn't come. Not on the timetable Catalino's patience could accommodate. The rage inside him was not a still pool. It was a pressure system building and building, and when it finally broke, it broke on the wrong people. One night, Catalino confronted the couple, Gregoria Rosas, the mother of the man who had stolen his wife, and Narciso Penalba, the man who shared her home. He demanded they tell him where Luchetti was, where his wife was, where his daughter was. They either didn't know or they refused to say, or their answers weren't satisfactory enough to cool the inferno that had been building inside Catalino since the day he lay bleeding on the floor of that caretaker's house in Mar del Plata. He pulled out a knife. What happened next was described in later accounts as a vicious attack of frenzied, unrelenting violence. Stabbing and kicking, not stopping when the victims fell, not stopping when they stopped responding, not stopping until the bodies on the ground before him were absolutely, irrevocably still. Two people, an elderly widow and her companion, people who may have known nothing useful, who may genuinely have had no information to give him. He killed them both. And then, in an act that speaks to a horrifying pragmatic coldness beneath the surface rage, he dragged their bodies to a nearby haystack, buried them under the dry grass, and walked away into the night. The first two murders of Juan Catalino Dominguez were committed with a knife, in the dark, in a quiet town, on two people whose only connection to his fury was that they happened to be standing close enough to it. And from this point forward, the pampas of Buenos Aires province would never be entirely safe again. When the bodies at the haystack were discovered, police launched a search for the killer. The investigation was thorough enough, and the trail of circumstances pointed clearly enough, that Catalino eventually became their prime suspect. But he was already gone, drifting across the enormous, sprawling countryside of Argentina, a country whose interior in 1944 and 1945 was a vast and largely unpoliced geography where a man on foot or horseback could simply vanish. They found him in Mendoza, the wine city in the foothills of the Andes, nearly 1,000 kilometers west of Buenos Aires. He was in a cheap hotel, not running, not particularly hiding. The police arrived, and Catalino, apparently sizing up the situation as unwinnable, offered no resistance. He was arrested. He was handcuffed. He was scheduled for transport to La Plata to face charges. He would never make it. During the transfer, passing through the town of Pergamino in the flat farmland north of Buenos Aires, Catalino told his guards he felt ill. He asked to stop. He needed to step out of the car and relieve himself. Standard, human, seemingly unthreatening. The guards, perhaps underestimating the man in their custody, agreed. They allowed him to remove his handcuffs. He walked into a cornfield by the roadside. He hung his coat on some plants at the field's edge, visible, recognizable, so that the guards waiting at the car would see it and think he was simply a short distance away, out of sight but not gone. And then Juan Catalino Dominguez walked straight through that cornfield and disappeared. No fugitive in the history of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police had made them look quite as helpless as Juan Catalino Dominguez did in the weeks and months following his escape at Pergamino. The man had vanished into a landscape designed by nature for disappearance. Flat, wide, endlessly repetitive, the kind of terrain that folds a man inside itself and offers nothing to the eye that comes searching. The pampas, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of grassland, scattered ranches, dirt roads, seasonal workers, and the particular anonymity that comes with being a laborer in a place that has always needed laborers and never asked too many questions of them. Catalino knew this world. He had been born in it, worked in it, stolen in it. He understood the unwritten economy of rural labor, how a man with strong hands and a willingness to work could arrive at a ranch without a past and leave again without a trace. He understood how the distances worked, how the roads connected and didn't connect, how far a man on horseback could travel in a night, how many different faces a person could show to different sets of strangers before any of them compared notes. He had grown up in a world where men moved seasonally from ranch to ranch, and he used that world now as a living cloak. While police scoured Rio Negro and the Neuquén province in the southern reaches of Argentina, convinced their fugitive had fled toward Patagonia, Catalino did the exact opposite. He went back. He went north. He went back toward Dolores, the very town where he had committed his first murders, the very place where the investigation into those murders was still active. Because Lucetti, Isabel, and Marta were in Dolores. The audacity of this is worth dwelling on. A man wanted for double murder, who had just escaped from police custody during transfer, walked directly back into the town where both those murders had occurred and where his enemies were living. This was not recklessness. This was the behavior of a man whose entire internal world had contracted to a single point, the point of revenge, and for whom caution was simply a tool in service of that objective, not a governing instinct. When he arrived in Dolores and found where Lucetti, Isabel, and Marta were staying, he moved to close the distance. But Lucetti and Isabel, either tipped off or simply fortunate enough to sense the danger, fled. They left. They abandoned Marta, the daughter, the small child caught in the crossfire of adult catastrophe, and ran. Catalino found himself standing in a place where his enemies had been, holding the one thing they had left behind: his daughter. What came next was one of the stranger, sadder passages in this story. Catalino took Marta and the two of them began to travel. A wanted fugitive and a small child, moving across the Buenos Aires countryside together, father and daughter in a landscape that was actively hunting one of them. He worked odd jobs under false names. He kept moving. He kept Marta close, perhaps because she was genuinely the only person left in his life he did not want to destroy, or perhaps because she was, on some level, useful. A child makes a man look like a laborer with a family, less like a fugitive. The police were not idle during this period. On April 20th, 1945, acting on intelligence that Catalino had been seen near Mar del Plata, officers descended on a farm at 1526 Rodriguez Pena Street, a property where Catalino had apparently learned his daughter was being kept for a period. He was there, and when the police moved on the location, Catalino did not surrender. He opened fire. What followed was a brief, violent exchange of gunfire. Commissioner Garcia shot Catalino in the left leg. Remarkably, the same leg that Rafael Lucetti had shot years before, in that bedroom in La Loma de Stella Maris. This time, the injury was more severe. In attempting to flee after being hit, Catalino fractured his femur, the great bone of the thigh, a catastrophic injury under any circumstances, let alone in the middle of a field while evading police. He was captured. He was hospitalized, again under guard, again in chains. He escaped again. The method was almost identical to his previous escape in spirit, if different in execution. Lying in the hospital bed, recuperating from the fractured femur and the gunshot wound, Catalino waited. He waited long enough to be considered stable, long enough for the surveillance routine around him to settle into a comfortable rhythm. Then, one night, he asked the guard to remove his handcuffs so he could use the bathroom. The guard complied. Catalino went into the bathroom, opened the window, climbed out onto the roof of the hospital building, on a fractured femur, through a storm in the dark, lowered himself from the roof into the garden below, crossed the garden, reached the street, stole a bicycle, and rode away into the night. A man with a gangrenous infection developing on his wound. On a bicycle, in a storm, gone. The Buenos Aires provincial police were searching for this man across 2 provinces while he rode a stolen bicycle away from a hospital window in the middle of the night with a festering leg. The enormity of his will, whatever dark and terrible engine was driving him, is almost impossible to process in ordinary human terms. With police now searching south and west, Catalino once again moved north, eventually finding himself drifting through the rural zones around Azul, a mid-sized agricultural city in the heart of Buenos Aires province. He was operating under the alias Donato Aguirre now, presenting himself as a transient ranch hand looking for work. He left Marta at a boarding house run by the owners of a local property, telling them he couldn't adequately care for her alone. This detail is striking. A man who had killed 2 people with a knife and exchanged gunfire with police, who had broken out of custody twice, who was living one step ahead of a murder investigation, apparently still felt something when it came to his daughter. He placed her somewhere safe, or as safe as any place could be, given the circumstances. But the local police were alerted by the boarding house owners when the identity of the little girl became suspicious to them. Marta's true identity was quickly established through investigation. She was removed from the boarding house and placed in the Hogar del Buen Pastor, a state institution. While police used this development to close in on the man who had left her there, Catalino learned that his cover was blown. He was in Chiller, a small settlement near Azul, working as a ranch hand for an employer named Guillermo Alberti, under yet another false name, doing farm labor, keeping his head down. On July 8, 1947, he discovered that his employer Alberti had learned his true identity. Perhaps Alberti had recognized him from a wanted notice. Perhaps the conversation had taken a wrong turn. Whatever the means of discovery, the result was instantaneous. Catalino did not try to explain, did not attempt to negotiate or flee. He walked into the kitchen of the ranch where he had been employed, and without saying a single word, he shot Guillermo Alberti dead. He then shot another ranch hand named Victoriano Serrano, who was present in the kitchen and had witnessed what happened, leaving no living witness behind. The disposal of the bodies was methodical in a way that speaks to something beyond impulsive violence. He hid Alberti's body under metal sheets. He tied Serrano's body to a horse, rode to a pit at some distance from the property, and dumped the corpse into it. He was cleaning up after himself. He was managing evidence. He was thinking, for people were now dead, and Juan Catalino Dominguez was still out there, still moving, still breathing the free air of the Pampas. He spent some time after the Chiller killings prowling the area around Azul at night, trying to get to the orphanage where Marta had been placed. The accounts describe him moving through the icy, dark nights around town, drawn toward his daughter the way a moth is drawn toward a light it cannot safely touch. But the police surveillance around Azul was now dense and attentive. A commissioner spotted Catalino near a boys' orphanage one night, causing him to bolt immediately, and after several failed attempts to navigate past the patrols, he was forced to accept that he could not get to Marta without being captured or killed. He left Azul. He left his daughter behind, and the Pampas swallowed him once more. The Buenos Aires province in the years between 1944 and 1948 was not yet the Argentina of mass media and rapid communications. News traveled at the speed of newspapers and radio broadcasts that reached only those close enough to a working receiver. Photographs were scarce, reproduced poorly, distributed slowly. A wanted man, particularly a rural man familiar with the roads and rhythms of the countryside, could move through enormous stretches of territory and encounter nobody who would recognize his face or connect it to the name printed on a police circular somewhere back in the city. Catalino understood this intuitively and exploited it as expertly as any criminal of his era. After abandoning Azul in the second half of 1947, he traveled, drifting through Tandil, then through his birthplace of Rauch, then through Dolores, El Tordillo, and General Juan Madariaga, and the surrounding rural territory. He used multiple aliases during this period, Pedro Montenegro, Pedro Aguirre, and slipped from job to job, ranch to ranch, taking whatever work was available, drawing as little attention to himself as possible. He was a nondescript rural laborer in a province full of nondescript rural laborers, and the very ordinariness of his occupation was his greatest disguise. Eventually, he made his way back to the coastal zone near Mar del Plata, settling for a period in the La Juanita neighborhood before relocating to Colonia Barragán, near Estación Cobo. There, he stayed with a neighbor named Bienvenido Basualdo, a farmer and cow herder. The proximity to Mar del Plata, the city where his story had begun, where the caretaker's house in La Loma de Stella Maris still stood, suggests something about the pull that place had on him. Whether he was looking for Luchetti again or for Isabel, or simply moving in circles that were geographically anchored to his wound, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Catalino was never going to settle. He was never going to simply disappear into agricultural labor and be forgotten. The violence was not a chapter of his life. It was his life. In early 1948, he had acquired a companion, a 17-year-old named Orlando Nelson Rosas, also referred to in some records as Alberto Gomez, who had escaped from a juvenile detention facility and was himself a fugitive. Two outlaws on the run, the 47-year-old ranch hand and the teenage escapee, drifting through the southeast of Buenos Aires province in the dying days of summer. What passed between them in terms of conversation, understanding, shared purpose, or simply the practical alliance of two people who had nowhere else to turn, is not recorded. What is recorded is what they did together on March 7, 1948. The rural area of El Trio, in the northern part of the General Pueyrredon Partido, a few miles west of Estación Camet. This was the location of the farm belonging to the Mahats family. Catalino had worked for this family previously as a gardener, and he knew the property, its layout, its access points, its contents. On March 7th, it happened to be Election Day. Election Day in Argentina at this period was a public obligation, and the Mahats family had left the farm to go and vote. The property was empty. The timing seemed perfect. Catalino and the 17-year-old Roses entered the farm with the intention of robbing it. They moved through the house, gathering what they could. It is impossible to know at exactly what point they heard the sound that changed everything. The approaching vehicle, the familiar voices, the noise of a family returning unexpectedly. Some of the Mahatses had forgotten their voting papers at the house. They had turned back. The first to come through the door was Martín Mahats, a senior employee at Mar del Plata's Casino Central. A man of middle age, coming back to his own home to retrieve documents, not anticipating violence, not prepared for the armed and cornered fugitive who was inside waiting. Catalino shot him 3 times. 3 shots at close range, fired with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been shooting people for years. Martín Mahats died on the floor of his own entrance. His 2 sons were outside or behind him, 22-year-old Martín Mayo Mahats and 19-year-old Marcelo Mahats. When they realized what was happening, they ran. Flight is the most human of instincts, the body overriding the mind and simply moving, propelled by the overwhelming logic of survival. But Catalino's revolver was faster. He shot Martín Mayo in the back as the young man fled. The bullet dropped him. The young man went down hard to the ground, and Catalino stood over him and emptied the remaining chambers of his revolver into the fallen body. 6, 7 times, until there was nothing left to fire. Marcelo was still moving. He had not escaped. Catalino's revolver was empty, so he drew his knife, the same instrument he had used on Gregoria Roses and Narciso Penalba back in those first dark days in Dolores. He went after the 19-year-old with the blade. He cut his throat. But Marcelo was young and physically strong, and the wound, catastrophic as it was, did not kill him instantly. He was still struggling, still clinging to consciousness and life in the terrible, stubborn way that living things do when violence comes for them. This is the moment in the Mahats murders that arrests the imagination in the most disturbing way. Catalino, facing a dying teenager who was simply not dying fast enough for his purposes, turned to his 17-year-old accomplice, Roses. The boy handed him a mace. And with it, Catalino finished what the knife had started, crushing Marcelo Mahats' skull. 3 members of the Mahats family dead in minutes, in their own farmhouse on Election Day, because they had forgotten their voting papers. The 2 killers moved quickly into the practical aftermath. They loaded the bodies of their 3 victims into the Mahats family car, the same car the family had driven back to their property minutes earlier, and drove south toward General Juan Madariaga. There, in the open field of a farmer named Angel Castellet, they unloaded the bodies and left them. They then drove the car back toward the tree line and attempted to hide it by covering it with firewood and branches, a cursory concealment that would fool nobody for long, but that perhaps bought them hours in the short dark window before dawn. Catalino then sought employment at La Eudocha, a local agricultural operation, presenting himself to the farm owner Juan Carlos Peterson under yet another false identity, taking on standard farm work and presenting the appearance of a traveling laborer between jobs. It was a performance he had given many times before. The routines of ranch life, the early starts, the physical labor, the communal meals, the evenings around the fire, were familiar to him, and he slipped into them with practiced ease. But fame, even the grim kind, has a way of circulating. One morning, a few weeks after the Mahats killings, Mrs. Peterson, the farm owner's wife, was reading the newspaper. The murders had made the news, as 3 bodies always do. She was reading the account of the killings at the Mahats farm. And as she read the description of the suspect, a middle-aged ranch hand of particular appearance with specific characteristics, something in her mind made a connection she was not entirely comfortable making. She looked up from the paper. She thought about the man working on their farm. She thought about his face, his age, his manner, his refusal to speak much about his past. She read the description in the paper again. She went and spoke to her husband, and the Pedersens notified the police. By the time officers arrived at La Eudocia to arrest Catalino, he was gone. Whether he had heard something, sensed something, or simply operated on a survival instinct finely tuned by years of narrow escapes, he had already left. The Pampas had him again. He was somewhere in the enormous, indifferent countryside, riding or walking or hitching across the flat land, calculating his next move. 3 more people were dead. The police were actively searching for him across multiple jurisdictions. His face, or a rough approximation of it, was in the newspapers now. And he was 47 years old, with a body that had been shot twice, fractured, and infected, carrying the accumulated damage of 4 years of violent fugitive life. He was running out of road. There is a particular quality to the final months of a manhunt, a closing in that is almost atmospheric, a sense that the net is tightening even as the quarry continues to move. In the early weeks of April 1948, Juan Catalino Dominguez was somewhere in the vicinity of General Juan Madariaga, the rural municipality in the southeast of Buenos Aires province whose fields and farmsteads he had been haunting for years. He had been moving between properties, taking on labor when available, surviving in the seasonal rhythms of a life spent outdoors, in the cold, in the dark. He was calling himself Pedro Montenegro. He was invisible until he wasn't. In early April, a local man named Pedro Jorgaiberry filed a complaint with General Madariaga's police commissioner. He had been robbed by a man, a traveler, a stranger, riding a sulky with red wheels. In the rural context of 1940s Argentina, this detail, the red wheels on the sulky, was as specific as a license plate number. It was distinctive, memorable, the kind of detail that caught in the mind and didn't let go. Commissioner Pedro Cavana took the complaint. He was a methodical man, it appears, attentive to the specifics of what was reported to him. He noted the description of the sulky with the red wheels. He noted the characteristics of the man who had allegedly been riding it. And something about these details connected with what had been circulating through law enforcement channels. The description of Catalino Dominguez, wanted for 8 murders across the Buenos Aires province, known to be operating in the area, known to be using multiple aliases, known to be a man who moved on horseback and by sulky across the countryside. Cavana made his preparations quietly. He assembled a small team, himself, Corporal Jose M. Diuberti, and a watchman named Raimundo Manrique. 3 men. They did not announce their intentions. They did not flood the area with uniformed officers and risk spooking their quarry. They moved in the early morning hours of April 18, 1948, in the darkness before dawn, toward the La Espadana field of General Madariaga. The pre-dawn hours on the Pampas are a particular kind of dark, the sky still holding night, the grass colorless and cold, the air carrying the specific chill of an autumn morning in southern Argentina, where the wind off the flat land has nothing to break its passage. The 3 officers moved through this landscape without fanfare, without drama, arriving at the property and presenting themselves to the man in charge, a local named Enrique Merlo. Merlo told them there was nobody else on the property. He was alone, he said. Nothing unusual here. Move along. But Commissioner Cavana looked past Merlo, past his words, past the ordinary surface of a farm at rest. At the back of the property, partly obscured but unmistakable to an eye that knew what it was looking for, sat a sulky, with red wheels. The 3 men began to search the property. What happened next unfolded in seconds, the kind of seconds that stretch in memory and collapse in reality, where the entire sequence of events from recognition to consequence occupies less time than it takes to describe. An unknown figure appeared on the property. He moved quickly, dropping into a position of cover as soon as he registered the presence of the officers. The trained, instinctive movement of a man who had spent 4 years learning that the appearance of police meant one thing and one thing only: action or death. He pulled out a revolver. He fired at the officers. Commissioner Cavana and his men were not surprised. They were ready, armed with Winchester rifles, the powerful, reliable lever-action weapons that had been the standard tool of law enforcement and frontier life across the Americas for decades. All three officers returned fire. The exchange was brief. It was brutal. It was conclusive, for shots struck the unknown man. One in the chin, one above the eyebrow, one in the finger, one in the stomach. He dropped. When the officers approached the fallen figure, they found a man of late middle age, lean from years of outdoor labor, his body carrying the accumulated marks of a life of violence. The old scarring from bullet wounds in the leg, the physical evidence of injuries sustained and survived across years of running. They identified him quickly. The man who had killed 8 people across 4 years, who had escaped police custody multiple times, who had slipped through cornfields and hospital windows and stormy nights on a stolen bicycle, who had used false names in 5 different towns and worked on farms within sight of the places where he had committed his crimes. The man lying dead in the early morning chill of the La Espadana field was one Catalino Dominguez. Born May 4, 1910, in Rauch, Buenos Aires Province, Argentina. Died April 18, 1948, in General Juan Madariaga, Buenos Aires Province, Argentina. Age 37. The ghost of the Pampas was dead. The aftermath of a killing like this one is never clean, never simple, and never contained. The networks of consequence radiate outward from the center in ways that touch lives far beyond the immediate crime. The story of what followed Catalino's death is, in its own way, as striking as the story of his life. Orlando Nelson Roses. The 17-year-old accomplice who had handed Catalino the mace with which Marcelo Mahat's skull was crushed during the triple murder at the farm in El Trio, was captured not long after Catalino's death, found at a nearby ranch. He was imprisoned for his participation in the Mahat's murders, but the duration of his sentence was short relative to the severity of what he had done. He was eventually released. He did not use his freedom wisely. He continued in a life of crime and was himself killed sometime in the early 1960s, the violent trajectory of his brief partnership with Catalino having apparently shaped the remainder of his life in ways no institution managed to redirect. Catalino's daughter, Marta. The little girl who had been taken from her father's caretaker house in Mar del Plata by a man who shot her father and drove away, who had then been taken across the countryside by her fugitive father, who had been placed in a boarding house under a false name and eventually removed to a state institution, was transferred after her father's death to La Plata, and then to an institute in Ingeniero Maschwitz, on the northern outskirts of Buenos Aires province. She remained in institutional care until adulthood. The details of her adult life are not part of the documented record. She was, in every meaningful sense, a casualty of this story who survived it physically but lived with its shadow for the rest of her life. And Rafael Luchetti, the man whose betrayal had ignited the entire catastrophe, appears to have survived. He had fled. He had kept moving. The engine of destruction that he inadvertently set in motion never caught up with him personally, though it destroyed everyone else it touched. 8 people died because Luchetti slept with his friend's wife and then shot that friend when confronted. There is no record of his being charged with anything. There is no record of his facing consequences proportionate to the chain of events he initiated. He disappears from the historical record, as people who cause disasters so often do, leaving others to manage the wreckage. The victims of Juan Catalino Dominguez deserve to be named clearly and completely, because history has a way of centering the killer in these stories and letting the dead blur into abstraction. The first 2 victims, Gregoria Roses and Narciso Penalba, an elderly widow and her common-law husband, stabbed to death in Dolores in 1944, died because they stood between Catalino and the answer to a question they may not have been able to answer anyway. They were collateral to a vendetta that was never truly about them. They were the first lives consumed by a fire that was lit in someone else's bedroom. Braulio Leguizamon, the ranch hand bludgeoned to death in a field near Azul on June 28, 1947, appears to have died because he encountered Catalino in an isolated field and either recognized him or simply happened to be in the wrong place at a moment when Catalino's instinct for violence needed no further provocation than the threat of discovery. Guillermo Alberti and Victoriano Serrano, the employer and the fellow ranch hand shot without warning in the kitchen and chiller on July 8, 1947, died because Alberti had learned who Catalino truly was and Serrano had been in the room when it happened. Alberti's discovery of his employee's identity was a death sentence delivered in the moment it was articulated. And then the Mahat's family, Martin Mayo, and Marcelo. 3 men shot, stabbed, and bludgeoned in their own farmhouse on an ordinary election day because they had forgotten their voting papers and turned back to retrieve them, interrupting a robbery that should have taken place in an empty house. 3 lives extinguished by a coincidence of timing so ordinary, so free of drama or destiny, that it defies any attempt to find meaning in it. 8 deaths, 1 life, 4 years of terror across the Buenos Aires Pampas, multiple prison escapes, a child raised in the shadow of a manhunt, a teenage accomplice whose brief association with this man bent the rest of his life toward its own violent end. What does the story of Juan Catalino Dominguez tell us? It tells us something about the specific, catastrophic intersection of wounded pride, consuming rage, and a landscape vast enough to allow a man to act on both without immediate consequence. It tells us about the failure of early intervention. A man with a theft record dating to 1933, a prison term in the early 1940s, and a subsequent explosion into murder who was never assessed as anything more dangerous than a petty criminal until the bodies started appearing in haystacks and under metal sheets and in open fields. It tells us about the limits of 1940s law enforcement in a country whose interior geography was, in practical terms, ungovernable by the tools available. But more than any of that, it tells us about the terrifying capacity of ordinary people to become something unrecognizable. Catalino was not a monster in the mythological sense. He was a ranch hand, caretaker, a chauffeur, a man who made a living with his hands in the flat, working landscape of the Buenos Aires province, who raised a daughter, who opened his home to a friend. The violence that emerged from him was not the violence of a creature born outside the human spectrum. It was the violence of a man whose internal controls catastrophically failed at a specific moment of extreme provocation, and who, once those controls were gone, discovered that he had no mechanism for rebuilding them and no instinct to stop. The Pampas of Buenos Aires province held his body for a while. The La Loma cemetery received him after his death, which is a kind of muted irony given the name of the neighborhood where his story began, in that caretaker's house in La Loma de Stella Maris. The land that had hidden him, that had swallowed him repeatedly when justice came looking, eventually gave him back in the only form that could no longer threaten anyone. He was 37 years old. The wind across the Pampas does not remember him. The grass that grew over the places where his victims fell does not remember them either. That is the task of the living, to remember, to bear witness, to refuse the erasure of the dead by the sheer passage of time. 8 names, 8 lives, a revolver, a knife, a mace, and one man's determination to prove to a world that had humiliated him that he was not someone to be discarded without cost. The cost was 8 lives. And then, on a cold autumn morning in the fields of General Madariaga, it was his. Thank you for being here and joining us through these dark and captivating stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I always love hearing where our true crime family is watching from around the world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.